in Jane Eyre, a novel that is profoundly Christian, deeply influenced by the Bible and Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. In that novel, ironically, Jane's last real temptation comes from a man of God. St. John is Rochester's opposite. St. John, the minister, evangelical, desirous of a career of celebrated missionary work, is extremely pious, pious to a fault. He is a man who values correctness of opinion more than furor of heart. He is a man more focused on proper outward behavior than in emotional yearning for God. This is a man who, in his desire to be sensually pure, ignores entirely the romantic overtures of a beautiful young woman. This is a man who wants of Jane total submission to his vision of what a missionary and his wife should be. Jane appreciates St. John deeply. After all, he saved her from almost sure death by starvation. He and his sisters, Mary and Diana, nursed her back to health. St. John then arranged for Jane to teach at a small school and ultimately starts to groom her to be his ideal wife as he will make his quest to eastern lands, where he will essentially try to destroy the ignorance of the so-called lesser peoples. Certainly St. John shares many of the Victorian prejudices concerning people who are not English, basically, in particular people of color. St. John believes that he should go in and convert the people of, say, India, suggesting by violence if necessary. So what does St. John need? He needs a partner to help him do this, and he thinks Jane can be this partner. And he basically says to her, look, you are destined to be a missionary. You have everything it takes to be a missionary. You are intelligent. You are industrious. You are pious. Come be a missionary with me and be my wife. Jane admires him to the point where she seriously considers this, knowing full well that if she agrees to be St. John's wife, she will lose all of her individuality. She will basically become a cog in his missionary machine. Furthermore, she will have a marriage that will be both loveless and sexless. Certainly, given her relationship with Rochester, highly passionate and highly charged erotically, she would not want this at all. But she says at a certain point that she is natured such that she either rebels hard against those with whom she disagrees, or she submits entirely to those with whom she does agree. We can see Jane clearly rebelling against a Miss Reed, for instance. We can see her rebelling against Mr. Brocklehurst, for instance. And then suddenly here's St. John, who is not a bad man. He's a man who does indeed love Jane in his own way. And so she does seriously consider becoming his wife and a missionary, partially because of the way he frames the argument. He says, clearly God has called you to be a missionary. And if you do not heed this call, you are sinning and condemning your soul. It's obviously the fallacy of the either or, but Jane is very seduced by this. But ultimately, she realizes that St. John is a man of ice. He is a sliver of ice in his heart. He is the exact opposite of Rochester. Rochester associated with fire, St. John, ice. Rochester associated with fleshy athleticism, St. John associated with a kind of marble reserve. Rochester, very sexy. St. John, quite puritanical when it comes to any kind of sensual pleasure. So Jane rejects St. John because of these qualities, realizing that to accept his vision of God, to accept his vision of religion, will ultimately lead to her losing her agency, an agency that she has fought for almost the entire novel. Of course, another factor of her rejecting St. John is the night that she prays for some sign to tell her what to do, and she hears her name uttered by a voice, ostensibly Rochester's. And of course, she finds out Rochester's plight, and she ends up marrying him. He's certainly much different than he was. He is no longer pure fire because he has been hindered by the fire set by Bertha Mason. He only has one hand, and he's blind when Jane first meets him. So he's been sort of figuratively castrated. So in a way, her relationship with Rochester by the novel's end allows her to transcend this dualism that she uses to describe herself in thinking about her relationship to St. John. With Rochester and Ferndean, after his accident, she is happy to submit to him as a spouse submits to another spouse in order to support that person. But what does she get in return? Rochester submits to her. They see each other as equals. In fact, the very language of submission is not appropriate. She says that my thoughts were his thoughts were my thoughts. Jane is able to both give over to Rochester as his spouse, submit, using that word again, but it's not necessarily accurate. While at the same time, she can stand up for herself. She doesn't need to rebel against him and reject him because she can feel the strength in herself in this relationship. So she gets in Rochester at the end a position that transcends the either or of I either am for you or against you. Now, of course, this logic is at play to some extent back before Rochester reveals to her that he is indeed married and was on the verge of turning Jane into an adulteress and a bigamist. When Jane and Rochester begin their flirtation, she calls him master. He is her employer, but she need not call him master all the time. Even after they've expressed their love for each other, she continues to call him master. There seems to be a part of her that wants to submit to him, that wants to give over to him. But yet, throughout the courtship, she's also very aware of pushing against him, rejecting him, being coy with him, not letting him feel that he has too much control over her. And one might say this was a sort of an ideal state, this tension between submission and challenge. What happens is this very dynamic, generative interplay between submission and challenge gets out of whack after Jane agrees to marry Rochester, because at that point he wants full submission from her. He no longer values her pushback. He wants her to wear the gowns, he will buy her. He wants her to wear the jewelry, we will buy her. And in doing so, basically wants to erase the parts of her that he was most drawn to. Jane herself says, I worshipped him as I would a god almost. By the time we get to Ferndean, these oppositions, submission and challenge, are still in play to a certain extent, but not in that generative, dynamic, fiery way they were in play in the courtship. They are quieter. It is a gentle, Jane gently gives into the union between her and Rochester, and Rochester gently gives into the union between him and Jane. But at the same time, they still enjoy each other's minds, enjoy each other's conversation. One imagines they enjoy each other's banter. So the interplay between submission and challenge always characterized the relationship between Jane and Rochester when the relationship was dynamic in the early parts, and when it became gentler, more tranquil near the end of the novel. Now, the question becomes this. Given that Jane chooses fire of Rochester over the ice of St. John, given that she chooses the sensuality of Rochester over the uh, puritanical qualities of St. John, why does the novel end with her describing St. John? She tells us, I married Rochester. I've been married to him for 10 years. My cousins, Mary and Diana, they got married too. Adele's going to a school close by, and she's grown up, and she's a fabulous young woman. But then the last long paragraph is about what's going on with St. John in his missionary work. And she praises St. John for his missionary work, for being a hero, for being essentially Christian in Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. He's fighting Apollon, who is the great demonic figure in Pilgrim's Progress. So the novel ends with praising St. John's brand of religion, praising his brand of Christianity, and praising St. John as kind of an exemplar of Christian behavior. Now, certainly she imagines that St. John will die soon, and that the next letter she receives from where he is stationed will not be from him, but from someone saying he has died. But she imagined his lack of fear in dying, his total confidence that he will be transferred up into heaven upon his death. That's the last scene we see from Jane Eyre, a novel that seems to celebrate everything that is not St. John. That's not to say the novel is not Christian. What makes Rochester ultimately the most attractive to Jane near the end is that he has lived out his Christian life too, to a certain extent. He has sinned, and he has acknowledged his sin, and he has suffered for his sin, and he is penitent over his sin, and he has been redeemed from his sin. But Jane does not use any overt Christian language to describe this. She's much more interested in the emotional content of Christianity. One might even say interested in a secularization of the psychological concepts of Christianity. Sin, penitence, redemption are there, but again, they're expressed in more kind of secular psychological terms, more in emotional terms. And that ultimately seems to be the brand of Christianity that the character Jane and the writer Jane values most. So that forces us to ask a question. Does Jane mean the last page of her novel ironically? Are we meant to see St. John's life as being ultimately wasted compared to Jane and Rochester's? They're choosing earthly happiness in a garden, Ferndean, a new Adam and Eve, fallen as it were, but working toward redemption constantly. Is Bronte saying that St. John's life, compared to the life of Rochester and Jane, is kind of a waste, that he squandered his life, and that we are meant to see that final scene ironically? Or is there a sense that Jane Eyre, as writer, who's constantly addressing us as readers, ultimately wants the novel to read like an overt Christian allegory, that she wants it to read like a modern Pilgrim's Progress? And in that regard, she is not simply paying lip service to St. John. She's saying this is a kind of Christian ideal that we should strive for. And maybe Rochester and Jane are not quite reaching that ideal, but perhaps they should. The novel, in other words, ends quite ambiguously. Why? Well, we don't know. What's the rhetoric of this ambiguity? In other words, what effect does this ambiguity have on us as readers? Well, I feel like part of what Jane learns in the course of her great pilgrimage is not to think in an either-or fashion, not to think I'm either for something or against something. The mature Jane realizes that one has to work to balance oppositions, that there's no absolute clarity in life, that life is kind of muddy and messy and muddled, and we do our best by trying to be generous and forgiving and honest, and that's the best we can do. So for the ending to be sort of irreducibly ambiguous might be fitting. suggesting that there is no one clear moral of the story of Jane Eyre, that it is complicated, that it is kind of messy and muddied and muddled. So, in a way, we could say that readers are put in the same position as Jane reaches an understanding of that life is not simply dualistic, that it is one thing and the other thing at the same time, not one thing versus another thing. That the novel itself sort of embodies the irreducible ambiguity of life. So, fittingly, the great novel by Charlotte Bronte is what it is about.